I'll do again. So I'm got part two coming up now. I got cut off in the last one. I didn't realise that my phone stopped recording at the 40-minute mark. I've never never done a video that long before. I never needed to. Normally it's just a quick flick or whatever I'm recording my kids doing and yeah. You've shown daddy cheers. Yeah, it was great. It was great. Yeah, let's watch it on the video now. Come on. That's usually it. So I'll carry on from where I left off. For anybody who's wondering, or you've just coming on part two, I'm just doing. I was going to do read the whole thing, but to be honest with you, with where I was getting in the last reading the first part of the document, and it didn't seem. It seemed to be explaining a lot about the methodology of the research, which is great. But I was wanting more really to get into the more interesting stuff, so I've skipped quite a bit. Um, but I'll carry on now anyway from where I'll probably repeat a little bit just to refresh, but I'll carry on anyway. So to continue. Consequently, bold assertions by the leaders of target states that they can withstand the competing, often intense domestic political pressures exerted by a migration or refugee crisis, and thus will not ultimately concede to coercers' demands, may ring hollow to challengers who can readily observe the sometimes hostile and escalatory. My goodness, I struggled to get that out of my mouth then, didn't I? Push and pull of democratic political battles. In short, this particular political liberalism motivated vulnerability arises from the fact that liberal democracies espouse what are supposed to be absolutist principles, but cross cutting cleavages and the inherently conflictual. Am I on the right page here? Yeah, I am. Yeah. Democrat. Yeah. Absolutist principles, but cross-cutting cleavages and the inherently conflictual nature of pluralistic politics make them anything but absolute, as Alexis de Tocqueville long ago. Apologies if I've butchered that name. So I believe this is a quote from that person. Foreign politics demands scarcely any of those qualities which are peculiar to a democracy. They require, on the contrary, the perfect use of almost all of those in which it is deficient. A democracy can only, with great difficulty, regulate the details of an important undertaking, persevere in a fixed design, and work out its execution in spite of serious obstacles. It cannot combine its measures with secrecy or await their consequences with patience. In other words, just as credibility can be a major problem for weak actors trying to convince more powerful ones to comply with their demands, credibility can prove equally problematic for powerful states if they are liberal democracies. Let's. In other words, just as credibility can be a major problem, yeah, credibility can prove equally problematic if yeah. No, that does actually make perfect because weaker democracies obviously have the issue of credibility because usually they're very corrupt countries um, engaging in nefarious actions. But then you can have the problem with wealthy countries where they espouse, oh, we're liberal democracies and aren't we so caring and loving, but we don't want to take all these people in, all these boat people, and that is well, that's what I was saying in my last video as well. And it's what I've said in a lot of other videos. I do think we've got to stop playing these games of emotions because we're going to get raked over the coals with them, and we've just got to stop saying, look, it's not our problem. We only care about the people in our country. It's like I've said it. A good way to think about it is you lock your door at night at home, not because you hate people outside, but because you love the people inside your home. And that kind of thinking and reaction is fractal, as in it grows and it's expandable. So you can say, like going back to the medieval times, they locked the city gates, not necessarily because they hated the people outside the gates, but because they loved the people within the gates. And it's the same when you look at your country. We put soldiers on the borders, not because we necessarily hate people outside the borders, but because we love people within the borders. That's been fractal. It's the same as it grows or as it shrinks. Of course, states, liberal and otherwise, do differ significantly in their capacities to shape and be shaped by their societies. The structural position of a state in relation to its society can be viewed as varying among the continuum for decentralized and constrained by societal groups of centralized and insulated from society. Analytically speaking, we can distinguish between soft, decentralized and constrained, and hard, centralized and autonomous states. So really between democracies and authoritarian nations, really. Soft states tend to be characterized by a high number of policy inputs and actors and relatively low levels of policy autonomy. Because they are most exposed to the vagaries of pluralism, we consequently expect the most highly liberalized and decentralized soft states, such as the United States, to be the most vulnerable of all. Yeah, well, it's true, because that's where we're seeing all these problems. Although, not only that, but democracies could be very slow to react to issues as well. Whereas if you got, and I'm not defending this, but like if China had a problem with mass migration, Xi Jinping could just snap his fingers, and the entire state apparatus will jump to that problem. But you don't get that, especially when you have checks and balances in place on different institutions between like civil servants, courts, lawmakers, military, police. Although the government say to the army, we want you to do this job, we're going to war, they don't actually tell the army how to fight the war. Or same with the police, they create the framework that the police operate within and arrest people under or investigate, but they don't actually tell the police what to investigate or how to do the jobs. Where were we? Because although further research is necessary to confirm the preliminary findings offered here, the data in Table 1, which demonstrates that the United States appears to have been the single most popular target of migration-driven coercion between 51 and 06, supporting this proposition. I've not looked at the tables properly. I'll probably have a look at it later for your own interest, but I wonder if that's the largest target due to the size of America and its population size, or is it the largest as in per capita as well? That'd be quite interesting to know. In sum, codified commitments to protect human rights and pluralistic politics can interact in such a way as to offer would-be coercers powerful bargaining leverage by their exploitation of what liberal targets rightly view as their virtues and, in effect, transform liberal democratic virtues into international bargaining vices. Well, basically, no good deed goes unpunished, and that's what that says to me. To reiterate, this represents the converse of traditional two-level game logic. Whereas in traditional two-level games, domestic actors seek to convince their international counterparts that they face significant constraints on their autonomy. In the coercive context, they seek to convey precisely the opposite impression. But due to the independent and joint effects of normative and political liberalism within liberal democracies, this can prove onerous at best. So moving beyond liberal democracies. So although liberal democracies are particularly vulnerable to this unconventional brand of coercion, they are not equally vulnerable, nor are they exclusively so. For one thing, variation exists in levels of political and normative liberalisation across liberal states. For another, many illiberal states possess some liberal characteristics and exhibit some measure of political and normative liberalisation, sometimes more than their supposedly liberal counterparts. We can conceptualize variation in the two sources of target vulnerability in a 2x2 matrix as a function of, on one axis, variation, basically a table, so you've got a left, one axis one way, one axis the other way. A variation in the degree to which the target has adopted and codified norms that provide rights and protections for refugees and migrants, specifically the human rights. This is just going to be about how to display this as a table, so I'm going to skip through this. I do apologise for this being boring. Right. That said, only rarely are all other things equal. For one thing, not all autocracies are alike. Like democracies, they too differ in the level, degree and scope of policy autonomy offered to the leadership. Yeah, I mean, a good example of that would be mid-century Germany and the USSR. Both very, very autocratic and fascistic in nature, but very, very different states and very different ways of governing with different goals and aims. Moreover, few leaders, even in illiberal states, can operate for long without the consent of at least a significant subset of their people. It's very true. The size of the so-called selectorate, a group of individuals formally responsible for determining the fate of the leadership of a state, also varies across the state. What is key, however, is that illiberal leaders too must answer to some subset of their constituents. Well, absolutely. You can't just have a tyrant who everybody in the country hates. At some point, they will get ousted. So domestic discord can exercise some, albeit weaker, effects within these states. Moreover, in an era of increasing globalisation, it is widely assumed that most states, and this will be interesting to read from 2010, because globalisation has been a massive contributing factor to mass migration at the moment, illiberal or otherwise, want to be a part of what is often referred to as the international community of states and to repeat the political and economic benefits enjoyed by its members. As Victor Cha puts it, illiberal regimes in the post-Cold War era have no choice but to open up simply in order to survive. Although the global economic crisis began in 2008 may have dampened the enthusiasm of some of the global project, the sentiment largely remains. Yeah, no, it's very true. And now, as we've seen with Nord Stream 2 getting blown up and the Ukraine war and things like that, we are starting to see civilizational states start to appear. And I do think globalization could be dying, and we may be going back to a pre-World War One sort of world where places like the Far East keep to their own sort of business and police their own area, and the sort of Western Europe and America type all sort of stick together, which is what it used to be like. Where were we? Thus, although these domestic constraints are fewer, the behaviour of the most liberal states is still subject to potentially costly external scrutiny. Non-democracies are therefore also vulnerable to the imposition of hypocrisy costs by other states and by international and domestic political actors, albeit rather less so than their liberal democratic counterparts. Well, a big thing with that was Iraq, and I know I'm going to get I don't want to go too deep into the Iraq war, and it obviously was a lot of other things involved in it, and I'm not necessarily supportive of the Iraq war myself, but Saddam Hussein was doing some horrendous things to his own people, and that in and of itself I think was a contributing factor to the invasion of Iraq. Not solely, and I do think a big part of that was him trying to create a gold standard for his currency. For the oil sales. I can't remember, it's a long time since I looked into that, to be honest with you. Alternative explanations. Might there be other explanations that can better account for or explain the decisions of targets, liberal or otherwise, to concede or resist? 3 obvious alternatives are worth considering. 1. Geographic proximity. 2. Size of a threatened mass migration. And 3. Prior target affinity or hostility towards a particular migrant refugee group, as manifested in the part by pre-existing policies directed at relevant migrant refugee groups. The first 2 alternatives are premised on the idea that a target's propensity to resist or concede is predicted on its ability to stop or absorb an influx. By extension, the smaller the distance from the source of the outflow and/or the larger the size of the outflow, the lower the probability that a target can independently combat or absorb the group in question. The higher the credibility of the threat to inflict the promised punishment on the target, and thus the greater the probability of the coercive success. Now that, I think, is outdated now, because at this point smartphones were still quite... This 2010, they weren't as ubiquitous as they are now. Same with the internet. This was before ease of using apps and Facebook becoming popularised, etc. Things like that. So I think now this author may actually change their opinions on that in the post Facebook app access world of mass information moving as easily as it does now. So even now people can coordinate, as we've been seeing going from Libya. You can watch it in real time. You can see the NGO ships, non-governmental organisations, literally sailing down all the way across the Mediterranean, hanging around off the coast of Libya, just a mile or 2 off the coast, picking people up and then sailing all the way back up again to Italy, doing about 800 miles. And then they'll travel all the way across Italy and then through Central Europe into the countries where they want to go. Or even with America, you're getting people coming from Africa or, the Middle East, going into South America, traveling through, maybe Brazil or Argentina or somewhere like that, traveling all the way through South America, through Central America, and then into North America. This is highly, highly organised now because of the ease of mass information. Where were we? As the data in Table 2 and Table 3 illustrate, history has been characterised by a myriad non-proximate success and by numerous proximate failures. In short, geography has been far less important than the degree to which targets are held responsible for and thus are compelled to respond to particular crises, whether for historical, domestic, constituency-driven or geopolitical reasons. For example, given the root culpability of the United States for what ultimately became known as the Vietnamese boat people crisis, it twice found itself vulnerable to coercion from afar by Hong Kong and a core group of Asian member states. In terms of evaluating the second alternative explanation, real or threatened migrant outflow size, obtaining reliable numbers of the precise size of outflows is difficult at best. Nonetheless, it is reasonably easy to distinguish among orders of magnitude from hundreds to millions. Although larger outflows assuredly place greater stress on the carrying capacities of states and affect their susceptibility to both swapping and agitation, the data demonstrate that overall outcomes are not correlated with the scale of the unnatural disasters in question. For example, both Ethiopia and Poland successfully convinced Israel and Germany, respectively, to make concessions over groups that were small, even by per capita standards, whereas India did not alter its behaviour to compart with Pakistani desires, despite an inflow of 10 million Bengalis who were relatively unwelcome for reasons other than pure numbers. So we've got another table underneath here. This goes on for a couple of pages. Skip past that. This leaves us with the final alternative: prior affinity or hostility towards a particular refugee migrant group. A great example of that would be, say, Muslims going into India. That would be massively unpopular there. That would create serious, or Chinese people as well, going into India. That would create some serious turmoil in that country. It has been hypothesized that a prior affinity or historical, e.g. colonial relationship with a particular group might affect the response of a target to attempt coercion. But in historical revenge, and this is something I spoke about in another video actually, in regards to the dementia patient being abused by Nigerian carers. And I've not got a definitive answer for this, it's just pure speculation, but I wonder, and this is on a smaller scale, if abuse like that has been caused for historical revenge reasons. And it's the same with some of this migration. Is it being pushed on the West as a form of revenge for colonialism? But in which direction, in favour of the group or against it? Well, that's what I was just saying, wasn't it? On the one hand, it is widely understood that target countries in which particular immigrant communities have become well established can have significant influence over their leaders, which would lead to enhanced support and heightened mobilisation within the pro-refugee migrant camp. And it is certainly true that asylum burdens are strongly positively correlated with historical links between countries of origin and countries of destination. Well, we see that in the UK. There's a lot of politicians who I can't remember, there's one of the Lords in the House of Lords was saying, well, I came to Britain on the Kinder Transporter, and for those who don't know, that was Jewish children who fled Germany, well, were smuggled to Britain from Nazi Germany, and rightly so. But what they fail to say is the cultural similarity between people from Northern Europe coming to the UK, especially at that time of history, say compared with somebody coming from the Middle East or Sub-Saharan Africa. You know, there's a big difference. And not only that, but you're talking about, say, a 5-year-old child compared to a 25 or a 30-year-old man, single man who's on an adventure. There's a big, those that is not comparing apples to apples. That's comparing apples to pears. You know, maybe if we were talking about a 5-year-old, child from the Congo, we'd possibly have a similar conversation there. But that's not what we're talking about with this. And we're ending up with hundreds of thousands, possibly maybe millions of fighting age men in the West from what could potentially be hostile countries. On the other hand, however, research has also shown that historically hostility and envy have not been highest vis-a-vis entirely foreign groups, but rather groups who have some ethnic or other affinity to that host country, such as Algerian Pied Noir forced to return to France in the 1960s after the War of Independence, displaced Germans resettling in West Germany after World War II, Ugandan Asians with British passports admitted to England. I mean, with the Asians with British passports, the really had no real connection with Britain other than Uganda used to be part of the British Empire. And at the end of the sort of empire days, I think it was Harold Macmillan said, everybody can have a British passport if they want one. And that was it, like people who'd never been to Britain before. It was everybody's a British citizen if if you've been part of it. It's just crazy. And I think I do think that's part of the ideology that's actually still pushing a lot of this mass migration, support for mass migration within the UK. I think it's a multifaceted problem, definitely. But I do think it's people thinking, well, anybody can be British. What even is British? Just a passport to people. That's all it is. So anybody can own a passport. And there's no consideration to the wider implications or the future problems that this could cause. British passports admitted to England, and Afghan Pathans moving into ethnically related areas of Pakistan. Well, they've all been kicked out now, or they're in the process of being kicked out of Pakistan now. So that's quite interesting to see that written there. Thus, it could equally, and I wonder if that's been related to that, because they had that massive earthquake, like, was it early this year or last year? A huge earthquake with terrible damage to the whole country. So I wonder if that's been part of the reason why they've been kicking out all the Afghans from Pakistan, because they just can't put up with them anymore, because they've got bigger fish to fry, I suppose. Something like that certainly does focus the mind, doesn't it? Thus, it could equally well be true that there you go, that's another way that it can be done. You can actually get rid of unwanted people from your country, even if they are fully settled there and have families and the lot. You just say, no, you're no longer welcome. Thus, it could equally well be true that prior relationships with migrant groups enhances the strength and size of the anti-refugee migrant camp. Should have prior relationships with yeah. Likewise, both situations highly developed affinity in one segment of society and highly developed hostility in another could simultaneously obtain, making coercive success still more likely. As Robert Hart rightly noted, previous immigration into a target state and its immigration policies towards the group that can play an important role. However, that role only has significant effects for its disruptive as opposed to absorbative effects for democracies. In short, existing relationships with particular migrant and refugee groups can and often do play a measurable role in determining outcomes, but whether those effects make coercive success more or less probable is case specific rather than systematically correlated, either directly or inversely, with the nature of the pre-existing relationships and policies. More to the point, prior relationships will indeed heighten potential effects in cases in which crises become salient to pro or anti camps, or to both. However, neither the existence of previous policies nor the nature of extant relationships is independently determinative, i.e., neither one is a necessary nor a sufficient condition for determining outcomes. So basically, that's saying, irrespective of whatever the political situation is in the country, that isn't going to determine whether the threats are going to work in the aims of the people threatening to do the coercive migration. I'm going to leave this at that. I'm getting on to 25 minutes now. We're not far off. There's only a couple of paragraphs left. It's just, I'll leave it. If you've found that informative, please like, subscribe and give us a comment below, and on the other video as well. Definitely download this yourself and read the full thing. I'm going to go through this on my own. I'm going to read the lot. As I said at the beginning of the first video, it's very dry. It's not the most interesting to read, but it's very informative. And I've seen a lot of things whilst reading through that definitely start putting things into perspective and are helping me at least make sense of what's happening in the world right now in regards to mass immigration that's happening. And it's just good to actually see it in black and white. And this going back to 2010, this paper as well. So this is before the Angela Merkel migration crisis, that she started. Funnily enough, this 2010 was the time that Angela Merkel said that mass migration had failed, or multiculturalism. I think Tony Blair said it around that time as well. I know he said it. I can't remember if that was 2010 or a bit later though. But Angela Merkel definitely said that it was either mass migration or multiculturalism failed, and that was in 2010. Anyway, I'm going to get going. Thanks for your time. I'll put the link below again. It is in the other one, but please do download this PDF. Read it for yourself. Thank you. Bye-bye.